Welcome to another episode of the Silmarillion Sessions. We're your hosts, Dr. Gail Thompson and Mr. William Lassiter. And today we're going to be continuing a conversation in the Silmarillion. We've just introduced some of the key figures of the elves going forward, and particularly the official moving migration of the Noldor, who become the Vanyar, the Noldor, and even the Teleri to Valinor, except rather the Teleri don't make it all the way to Valinor. Their island gets moved just a little bit into the Bay of Eldamar. And so you may be wondering where Eldamar is and what it is, for that matter. And we've got a wonderful map here from the Encyclopedia of Arda that hopefully I think we can put up here. Anyway, share the link in the show notes. That can show some of the places that we're talking about today and also some key timelines. So do find that information in the notes related to this episode here, because that really helps to situate the sometimes really obscure names. Might be hard to pronounce, but even harder to try and figure out where they're situated in relation to one another. Because, as we mentioned at the end of last episode, what we're going to be moving into here as we go along is a lot more plot-driven movement within the Silmarillion, and we really start to get characters interacting with each other. So we're shifting, and I think this is a very interesting aspect to look at. We're shifting from sort of mythic space, so far as we've explored the creation of the world, the creation of the Valar, the creation of the world, the awakening of the elves. The narrative has run along sort of we're discussing sort of a dream time, right? There was a time before when these things were coming into being, and less being moved directly by individual protagonists, with a few side notes here and there of very specific detailed sort of fables, like Elwë Thingol getting waylaid and falling in love with Melian and mingling with the divine, right? Because she's a goddess, and that episode is there, but it's an episode situated within this broader mythic dream time kind of space, and we're really wrapping that phase of the Silmarillion, wrapping up that phase of the Silmarillion and moving into some of our key protagonists. So we'll see Feanor, the sons of Feanor, and other family members with that, including your favorite Galadriel. And we will see Celeborn, and we see place names. We've got Tirion upon Tuna, and the Calakiria, and Alequandone, Alqualonde, excuse me, and Taniquetel, and Ilmarin, and these places in Valinor, in addition to what we'll see moving later on. So we should situate some of those events on the wonderful timeline of Middle-earth and some of the places on the maps, as well as the names we can see in, of course, lovely appendices to some of the works that have the genealogies that help us understand who is who, how they're related to one another, why that's important. But why don't we start with the basic title of the chapter, Eldamar, the Princes of the Eldalie, and also Tuna, Tirion, and the Noldor. Let's situate ourselves a little bit geographically first, I think. Where is Eldamar? What is Eldamar? Is that different from Valinor? Why is it called that? And quick recap, who are the Eldalie? Why are we, what is that?
Okay, so there's a lot that you're asking here. And as I said at the beginning of all of this, I'm no Tolkien scholar. I'm finding out a lot of this stuff as we go along, just like a lot of people. So I just find it fascinating, great interest in it. So let me do a few things here. First off, I want to share screen here, if that's okay, Cameron, because there's this great resource that I think is worthwhile looking into. So bear with me while I figure out technology, because I'm an old fuddy-duddy. And this is a great resource. I think I mentioned this last time. This is from the LOTR project. Here it is. Yes, the LOTR project.com. If you go to this, you'll see this great resource here. It's an interactive map and timeline as well that allows us to, through the miracle of the internet, see where things are situated. And this map, I think, particularly was done by Karen Wynne Fonstad. You can get her whole book of Middle-earth maps through Amazon. It's called An Atlas of Middle-earth by Fonstad, Fonstad. And this one, which is Beleriand, you can switch between Beleriand and Middle-earth over here. And Beleriand, so if I want to go to Middle-earth, I just click over here and it gives me there's Middle-earth with the journey of Bilbo situated in blue there, or outlined in blue. But we'll go back to Beleriand here. Beleriand is an area that is west of the familiar map that we know from Hobbit and Lord of the Rings, because by the time that we're in that age, the Third Age, we're dealing with a land that had already been inundated by a massive wave, which will come later in the narrative here in Silmarillion. So all this land here that we're looking at in this map was underwater, or eventually is poured over, and the only thing left is this string of mountains here, and then west of that. And that string of mountains that we're seeing on the far right of this map, if I go to the Middle-earth map, is not this map of the Misty Mountains, not that. It's actually these, the Araluan Mountains, if my understanding is correct. So these mountains here, Beleriand is to the left of all of that. It's really far out here. Sorry, it's really far out here to the west, because all of this was inundated by water at some point. So I'm going to go back to Beleriand.
So, if I can interject there, so in the time of The Hobbit and The Lord of the Rings, the Grey Havens is actually significantly inland.
Yes.
Is situated in a place where way back in ancient days was really inland there. Is that right? I mean, that's essentially where those mountains are.
Yeah, that seems to me to be the case. If we go back, this is the Middle-earth map here. The Grey Havens and the Gulf of Loon, that's right around here, I think. I believe that's right. Let's zoom in a little bit. Yeah, here it is. Mithlon, the Grey Havens, is right around here, Gulf of Loon.
Yep.
And all that territory was essentially like the mountains here were the far right of the
So it's like
map,
a mountain
this
pass.
area here.
Okay.
Yes, yeah, right, exactly. Yeah, a mountain pass. And all that survives of the original land are these little liminal areas, these little shore-like areas along the way, because everything else was just covered over by this huge wave.
Sure. Forlindon and Hoddlindon.
It's an absolutely fascinating thing that Tolkien does here, and I think we should talk in depth about it. But just to quickly mention, first off, it's fascinating because he was probably basing a lot of his stuff on the myth of Atlantis. It's true with a story in Greek mythology that Plato recounts, where the island gets inundated by a wave. But I wonder about that because there is rumor in Saxon literature of a similar inundation. You know, it's hinted at here and there. And we now know for sure that there was a massive inundation in the time period of human history there in the North Sea. That what is now the North Sea was all of an open plains area like the Midwest of America. It was this flat, fertile, kind of marshy area that was just abundant with all sorts of animal and vegetable life. And humans used to traverse the area, hunting these elk and other creatures across the surface of the land. But at some point, two things happened, apparently. One is that there was an ice dam. This is at the very end of the Ice Age. All this happened, the last Ice Age. An ice dam actually broke in North America, and it let loose this huge amount of fresh water that was backed up behind the ice dam into the Atlantic Ocean. And that caused the whole of the Atlantic Ocean to surge up on the other side of the ocean there in Europe. And it inundated a huge portion of that territory, what was called Doggerland, this Doggerland area. And then soon after that, in geological time, we're talking like a couple hundred years, soon after that, there was a massive sea cliff that fell somewhere off the coast of Norway, I think. And that also caused a massive disruption, a tidal wave like what happened in Japan. And it moved across the surface of the earth and fully inundated the land all the way up to where we now have our coastline there in northern France and the marshy territories of the north. So all that territory that we have in the North Sea is very fertile, open plains area until it's not. And we're talking days change. This is not over a long period of time. This would have happened in an amount of days. Okay, so you're sitting there, you imagine that I sit there on the plains, you're like hunting your gazelle, and suddenly this wave comes, you're like, oh, this could be bad. And and after that, if you survived it, that whole territory was just fishing land, and that's all it was. So
there's
it looks like
this ancestral memory in the, especially among the northern peoples, of a sudden cataclysmic flood that inundated land. And that's the kind of thing Tolkien is tapping into, or at least tapping into that same theme.
Right. This map here seems to have some really good. Yeah, this is Tuor to Gondolin. Like, you can click on this. It's what's it called? Sorry, gotta unclick it. There are bodies of water you can search for. It will show bodies of water, like so. Settlements, you can click on that, and it shows settlements in the map itself. You can go to timelines on the right hand side, and it will show you a series of timelines that then. Oh, this is interesting. Use of undefined constant events and event this, and so blah blah blah. Anyway, this series of timeline events that occur here on the right hand side that you can then find there on the map. And the map itself is really it's a pretty keen thing to have. But let me go back to refresh the whole thing. This shows a map of Balarian. This shows a path here on the right. And the path that we're looking at right now is Tuor to Gondolin. So how Tuor travels around this area here. But I could check it. Looks like Turambar and Baron that they have on here too. So later in the text, we can look at their pathway where they go to. But anyway, the point being, this is the territory that we're dealing with here in Middle-earth for the time period of the Silmarillion. When we look at the Undying Lands, which is where the elves are all called by the Valar, that's way over here to the left. It's over here to the west of West Balarion.
So this might be an opportunity to situate what we just went through in the last episode, is the migration of the elves. They came across the mountains here on the far right, and then moved left because we're looking at the map this way. It's a little crooked because it should be oriented east up, as we all know.
Right.
We can soapbox that another day, and why that's important, especially even for Tolkien. But they move west across the map, and they get out there, and so that's where the elves move across, and then that's where later the Pelori, who have stayed east of this mountain range on the right side of the map, they make eventually a number of them, not all of them. The close kin of Thingol obviously stay, but they make their way across then as well, and they get the island ride that we talked about in the last episode.
Yes.
And so the Undying Lands are off far to the west of the sea, of the Great Sea that we see here on the left hand side of the map. Is that right?
Mm-hmm. The Great Sea here. And if I remember right, when that island occurs, that island ride, as you said, the Umo gives them a piece breaks off and remains behind. That sound right to you?
Yes, that's right.
Yeah, that piece that breaks off when he gives them this bit, I think it's down here in the Bay of Balar. I think it's this. Let me zoom in here. I think it's this. Oh, doggone it. Yeah, down here. I think that's what we're talking about. So the Isle of Balar, I think, is the name of it.
Yes. Yep.
Okay. So then, yeah, this is the piece that was the remainder from the island that took the elves across. So they would have come down. Let's see if I can zoom out here again. They would have come down this way across, going west. And Doriath is here. That's the territory that Thingol is with Melian, is in Doriath. If I get that straight. So that's where he has his kingdom. And this is this whole thing is very similar to what we see in the Bible and other great works, where the legend will hold that this happened and that piece of land over there is testimony to the fact that it happened. So, for instance, I don't know, you might say that Noah, the ark came to rest on Mount Ararat. And we know that's true because look, there's Mount Ararat. It's right there. And I mean, you can actually find the mountain even today of where Ararat was. And so you say, well, this must have happened because there's the mountain. So it's like a permanent testimony to the legend being the veracity of the legend. And
Mm-hmm.
we could, you could parse that out in a modern context and say, well, they just looked at the land and then made up a story. But you could also say, well, yeah, but you could also say the story existed and it really did happen on that piece of land. That's a possibility too. So
That's a very
one way or
plausible
the other.
possibility. And I think psychologically, a very interesting thing that happens here, and this is the pattern that professionally, I believe, is more sort of culturally the norm for cultures to adopt this kind of thing is that you have, precisely like you said, there is the story, and you can trace this. There are peoples who live in a place that will situate something that's geographically happening here, but a story that story predates their arrival in that location. Like the story is actually shared by their ancient ancestors who
Yeah.
came from, the Eurasian steppes or something. But what's interesting about that, this doesn't disprove that the story didn't happen, but it actually disproves the idea that, well, they saw a land formation, they came up with a story to explain it. Rather, they have the story, and finding a location physically, whether it happened there or not, it may, I think that's very plausible. Often there are things that physically happen right in this place where the stories say, because there's no reason to believe they didn't. But that the idea of situating a story in space makes it easier to remember. I mean, how do you say, there's something powerful about situating something in geographic time and space. And this is why people, when memorizing something, will try and use sort of a memory palace technique, or you situate, if you're memorizing your Greek grammar tables, you might situate your charts in different places on the wall in your dorm room as you're trying to memorize these things, because physically situating something in space helps you remember it better, and helps it. And it's not just easier recall, but it gets ingrained even deeper into your own psyche, into your own self and sense of self. Say, we are part of this place. We were born from the very ground. It's very abstract. You say, but our forefathers were born from this very ground right here, this particular spot, and that ties you to a location, because we're physical beings. And I think there's something very powerful in that. And that's what Tolkien is in very many ways doing. I mean, he situates things very specifically in locations in Middle-earth on these maps here.
Oh, yeah. Sure.
But he also then identifies, because again, the whole frame of all of this is ancient prehistory of our world. He's very open in talking with actually his map makers who work with the publisher, of saying, okay, this, Hobbiton is roughly on latitude with Oxford, and Ithilien is roughly on latitude with what's the city just north of here? Ravenna. Ravenna,
okay.
Right? And so he identifies some of these. Okay, so that should give you a sense, both latitudinally and longitudinally, how far apart they should be, and what kind of climate they should have. And so situating these things, not saying those are exactly these places, but saying, hey, these are real things. And he does tap into these Anglo-Saxon, these ancient memories of, I don't say just Anglo-Saxon, but Celtic, Nordic, northern peoples, because that's where he's living.
Yes.
These ancient memories of these northern peoples that link to an ancient history of these various events that happen in geographic locations that may be already subaqueous, underwater at this point in time in the 20th century, but may also point to very specific mountains and hills, say, in Ireland. And what we're going to, one of the things I know we want to talk about today was the Hill of Tuna. And one of the things that just I can't get out of my mind, because I spent a lot of many years of my earlier life delving into ancient Irish mythology and anthropology, history of Gaelic peoples actually arriving in Ireland from Iberia, and the idea of the Hill of Tara. Every time I hear or see the Hill of Tuna, I think Tara and the Tuatha Danum, and these ancient peoples and certain sacred hills, these principal places where things happen. And I'm not saying he's building off of that, but it's the same kind of logic, that there are these important sites. But you see this in the Near East too. You've got Mount Horeb, or you've got the space between the two rivers, Mesopotamia. You've got Mount
Yeah.
Sinai. These significant places that play again and again
And
into
yeah. And
different
it's
actions. Yeah.
and it's so strong in the human imagination that people still fight over it. I mean, they're still fighting over the Dome of the Rock, and they're still fighting over certain parts of land. And it's not just they're fighting because they're driven by an ideology; they're fighting because of the land itself in some ways, And yeah, it's hard for a modern, I think, get this because we're so disembodied in general. You had mentioned that earlier that we are incarnate creatures. We are soul and body at the same time. And so time and space really do have an effect on us, even in our digital disembodied world. So, yes, it's amazing to me to think about how the ancients would have said that hill over there is a hill of power, or this line here is a ley line. And, you walk that ley line for your pilgrimage, and the area is crisscrossed with them. For us to conceive of that is very difficult. And so we want to think of it in terms of an economic thing or as a purely mechanical universe, as just a physical world, right? And we don't think that, like, Tintagel, for instance, was probably a fortress that was supplying the mine that was north of that area there in Wales. That's probably what Tintagel was about. So Tintagel, which is the seat of King Arthur, is probably an economic center, but it was a spiritual center, and this idea of this territory being spiritually charged, or full of spiritual energy, goes way, 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 way back, probably before any of the Arthurian legends even came into life. So a similar thing happens here. We see these territories in Middle Earth that are charged with a power to them, an ancient power to them, and they have a history to them that is still manifest. I was just reading the section. Well, I was letting Andy Serkis read to me. Thank you, Andy Serkis. I was letting Andy Serkis read to me about the attack on Weathertop, there in the Lord of the Rings, which is amazing chapters. Wow, ripping chapter. But the fact that Weathertop was this ancient, like, volcanic outcropping upon which fortress was built to command the territory. It wasn't just there was a fortress there, it was that there were still energies and powers there, and like almost like ghosts, you could say, that inhabited the territory. It wasn't just an important site because it had a military command of the area. It was an important site because it had this spiritual energy attached to it. But I think you said that about a lot of the different things here in Middle Earth, including these territories that we see over here on the right, which were the original plains that were then inundated. Imagine what that land would remember if it had a consciousness, or imagine what that land could reveal if it had a consciousness. There's just an area south of here called the Driftless area, and the Driftless area is a territory which you pass by all the time, and people just don't even pay attention to it hardly. It's it's close to Wisconsin Dells, and that's where all the fun is. But the Driftless area is actually a powerful part of the world because it was the territory that was not covered over by the mile high of ice during the last ice age. It had no drifts on it, no snow drifts. What that means is that whole area still harbors flora, at least, and probably some fauna that predates the last ice age, unchanged, right? That blows my mind. The rock there was never covered over by the ice, never ground down by the ice. The flora and fauna there prospered even up into the modern era. If you go to the Driftless, you can study creatures that are easily 12,000 or 14,000 years old. That's really amazing to me. And I think that Tolkien is tapping into that with this business. If you go to this part of Middle Earth, you will see things that are, well, most of it's now underwater, but that you would they would have contact with a very, very old history to them. So, yeah. And let me just point out something too. When we go from this area of Middle Earth to the Undying Lands, we're moving west. And there's no real description of those Undying Lands that we can make a full map of. It's still part of that, as you mentioned, dream time thing that we're dealing with here. I noticed in Lord of the Rings, that things happen in Lord of the Rings and in Hobbit that are specific dates, and he puts things on very specific dates. So we're coming up to the equinox on the 20th, and then we're coming up to the Feast of the Annunciation on the 25th, which is also the Feast of the Ring going in the fire, intentionally. And
Right.
Tolkien did that throughout Lord of the Rings, but he doesn't do that in this Silmarillion. Silmarillion doesn't have, I don't think up until the very end, it doesn't have things on a specific date at all. Still in dream time,
No.
right?
Well, and that's an interesting thing because the Silmarillion, remember, is elvish story.
Yes.
It's like this is one of the elvish peoples is their own record, right? It's their own literature. Whereas
Yeah.
The Hobbit and The Lord of the Rings are respectively Hobbit and Mannish. It's really, and The Lord of the Rings is also Hobbit, but adapted to Mannish.
Yes, right.
The idea is that there's manuscripts adopted to Mannish stuff. But yeah, the Silmarillion is elves, and elves just don't seem to be as concerned with annual dates because they live. They don't have the same reckoning. They don't even have the same experience of time. It's one of the things that is discussed between Legolas and company, while by Legolas and Gimli, as they're pursuing the orcs, taking the hobbits to Isengard and all of that, is, hey, by the way, elves experience time radically differently.
Yes.
Let's get going again. They keep running. And so this is just not, it seems, why would they put dates, right? That's just, they don't think annually like human beings or hobbits.
Right. They have a long stretch vision of time in general, and we, being annual creatures, we don't even know that we think this way. We just do think this way. We think, oh, Christmas is coming,
Right.
and the goose is getting fat, or we think, oh, if I can just get to the end of the week on this darn job, or we think, oh, the sun's going down, now's the time to go out and party, that's how we think. Elves don't think that way at all. They are not locked into this cycle around the sun, or the cycle of the sun around the earth, whichever way we want to look at it.
I mean, they remember a time before there even was a sun. I mean, that's something to really crack your mind. California was there before the sun was a thing.
I can remember when they finally put the sun in the sky. Wow, thanks, Grandpa Elf. Yes. And Tolkien's really, I think it's really cool the way Tolkien does this, not just with the time shift thing. So you shift from a sort of elvish vision of time, of non-solar to solar, but also with the shift of physical structure. So like this map, which is it's reconstructed. Tolkien did not draw this. This was done by Fonstad based upon his descriptions. But you notice it's basically just mountains, forest, et cetera, et cetera. There's no attempt to create a symbol through the map itself, so that the physical thing is kind of dreamlike. And you certainly get that when you look at the map of the Undying. It's a very undefined territory. But when you get to Middle Earth, this is striking. Middle Earth is where Hobbit and Lord of the Rings take place. I'm going to switch to that real quick. You look at the map of Middle Earth, and there's something rather startling about it. That the map of Middle Earth, which Tolkien did explicitly describe and draw, and then Fonstad took that and created. I think this may be her version, but also maybe somebody that Tolkien directly encouraged. The map of Middle Earth houses a physical statement, a concretized physical statement. It's much more precise, and so we know exactly where Mount Doom is, and exactly where Lonely Mountain is, and exactly where the Shire is. But look at the structure of this. This is really startling. There's a square box down here, which is Mordor, and we've got these mountains here, which the Anduin blocks, and then we've got the mountains going north, and they have to travel through those mountains with the goblins and through those mountains with Moria. But if you put that all together, the shape here is actually a dragon. You have the head of a dragon here in Mordor, with the eye of the dragon being a Radruin. The neck of the dragon goes up here, roughly to where Saruman, has his stronghold. And then the back of the dragon goes north and then curls around, and it comes back spiraling and spiraling until it lands right at the doorway of Bilbo's house. So really, if Bilbo were to follow this pathway, he could spiral around and just travel down this corpse of a dragon down to Mordor. And that's certainly what they do in Lord of the Rings. They go across and they go down and then through the heart of the dragon and then down again and into the eye of the dragon. So the whole of the physical structure in the map of the Middle Earth in the Third Age is based upon an idea or principle or a I don't know what you call it, a philosophy. It's infected with dragon stuff, which you don't get in the Silmarillion maps at all. They're much more airy and I don't know, abstract. But I find this physical nature of Middle Earth to be absolutely fascinating that he would do this thing. Anyway,
it's really, really interesting. Yeah, and again, that speaks to his geographical situatedness. That the land that you're in or the land that you traverse is just as much a part of the psychological, spiritual, whatever journey that you travel as the interior. They're not separable. And that's just, this is just true of culture, right? People living in a certain place have a certain kind of culture that's there. I mean, essentially, it's the interaction of peoples with their environment, peoples with each other and with their actual environment. So people who live in the mountains will have a very different expressions of their social structures, of their annual cyclical patterns and whatnot, clothing, obviously, and food, obviously, who live in the high mountains very differently from people who live down in warmer climes on the coast, or in island peoples, or people who live in the forests or the tundra, the Great Plains. And in many ways, you may see greater similarities between people who live in the Central Asian steppe and peoples who lived up until a certain cataclysmic event across the Great Plains of the United States or the prairies of Canada, who are far, far apart and relatively unrelated to each other. But they inhabit the same kind of space, in general terms, and they may have a similar kind of culture and social structures, but is going to be very different from peoples who live maybe relatively next door, but on the shores of the Caspian Sea or on the shores of Lake Kichigumi. They're going to live differently. So somebody in the West Midlands in England may have a different culture than somebody even very close living on the coast or further up into the mountains. To say nothing of course, the Sicilian peoples or the Iberian Northwest, that kind of thing,
who have their own history and connection to the Franks.
Right.
Let's talk about that city of Tuna, the hill of Tuna, for just a minute. Let me draw up a map. I got a map of that too. I think that's it's just one of these. That hill of Tuna interests me though, because that, first off, we talk about different ways that that people think. Well, here are these elves that have been taken across the Undying Lands, which is, it's like heaven. It's a heaven territory. It's undefined, but it's certainly filled with light, and there are some geographical points to it. The name Tuna is it means hill or mound mound in Quenya. Let's see, just hill or mound. It's not the same word as we say for tuna fish. Just to get that out of the way.
No, it's not related to little.
Nah, not at all. That's actually taken from Greek. Well, it's taken from Spanish, which is taken from Arabic, which is taken from Greek. So it goes this weird kind of route. Same route, by the way, that the works of Aristotle took and were introduced back.
That's exactly what I was going to say. Just like
Europe, But the original Greek was a funny fish, and when you look up that in a Greek dictionary, is that theta upsilon nu upsilon funny fish. It's basically a tuna fish. That's all it is. It's the type of fish, so it's not a surprise. But the Arabics called it an altuna, and then that or an altun, and then that got transferred to Spanish.
That was the tune.
Yeah, basically, the tunfish, and then that changed to atun or atuna, and then it became just tuna in English. So different word. Different origin. Yeah, this one means hill. Hill and mountain
means hill, and it's obviously the derivatives, and he's building in all of this, these kind of primal terms, major land formations, common animals, not evolve. These words stay persistent over thousands of years. across different human cultures. And so we're getting anchor points in ancient Elvish for common Indo-European words here as well. So like tuna, tundo is in fact big round thing. So tundo is Latin, is Italian, one of the Italic languages for big round thing, right? So you get the notion that it has a more ancient history. Same with ambo, the place where, you know, in various Christian churches, the preacher might go up to the ambo. It's a raised place that rises up above the congregation where they preach from. And so he's tying in these connections there. And again, umbo with Umbria, which is actually the region that I live at the very edge of, in Italy, Umbria is actually closer related linguistically, perhaps in the Latin mind, to shadiness, having shadows, shadiness, shadowlands, fog, mist, these kinds of things. Umbra meaning shadow in Latin, but it derives from the people's own ethnonym, their own name for themselves in the area, totally unrelated to Latin, but that's how it's appropriated to Latin. But you could say, well, umbro might actually be, you know, if you were hypothesizing an ancient multi-thousand year prehistory, that might come from umbo, hills, lumps, clumps, masses of hills clumped on one another is essentially the defining characteristic of the region.
Yes. Yeah, and it's got this great onomatopoeia to it as well. That sound of the words sounds kind of like what you would imagine the sound of a rock would sound. Right?
Right.
Yeah. It doesn't have a light area like the language of the rabbits and Watership Down, where everything's off. You know,
that's what rabbits in fact say.
You know, rabbits sound like that. They got all this hair all over. But yeah, there's a real weight to that sound, the mound of hill. And I wonder how far back that goes. That would be really interesting to find out if that is deeply steeped somewhere in Indo-European. I don't know. That's quite fascinating. So anyway, the mound, the tomb is where the
mound, because it's the one that's closest to his home. So what he calls that kind of thing. To go on back to the Hobbit, you know, he's talking about, why does he call it the Carrock? Well, Carrock is his word for that kind of thing, and he calls it the Carrock because it's the one he knows best.
Yes.
And of course, Carrock is the Gaelic word for a particularly jagged rock that sticks out from something. Or nowadays pronounced as Creg, but same word.
As in Craigslist?
Not quite, but
sorry. Craig or the Carrack, which is, again, you can look at even in The Hobbit, where they have the home of Bilbo is on the hill near the river, under which is the tree.
Exactly right, because that's how you name things nearby.
Yes. You know, it's kind of interesting. I never thought about this before, but the Hobbit, Bilbo and Frodo both start in the land where there is the hill, the tree, the water, and then they go off and they journey elsewhere. What are we looking at when we look at that land of Valinor? But there's the hill, which is lit by the trees, and they've just crossed over the water to get there. Isn't that weird?
Bingo. That's a very good point, because that's precise. So then that situates the quotidian act of Bilbo leaving his front door on the hill, going down and crossing the water on the great adventure. It links it to this bigger mythic history. It's a micro repetition of the larger, it's this leitmotif, this larger theme in the whole composition of the lifespan of Arda. That we see in larger tomes, both with the elves moving across the water to go to the hill, and then leaving the hill, Tuna, then leaving that to come back across after the kinslaying. They come across, they don't exactly cross the waters, they go around them, but there's this notion.
Same principle.
It's the same principle, and they do cross waters. They just happen to be solidified waters, frozen ice, but they cross the waters back over. So this coming out down from the hill, across the waters, and it's just
you said leitmotif. That's an interesting way of putting it, because, of course, how did this whole Silmarillion begin? It began with a song. It began with a song, and then it And the
Exactly.
song had repeated patterns that then began to concretize in the world itself. So what we're seeing here is we're seeing that leitmotif that began with, right, with the LOTR, that then concretized into the creation of Middle Earth, which then concretized into the story that the elves go through, which then
Mhm.
concretizes again into the story much, much later that Bilbo goes through. Wow.
So
Okay.
it's these
That's kind of
little fragments. It's
that's
this
sweet.
fractalism, right? Like a
Yeah.
beautiful
Yeah.
polyphony or a rose window. These fractal things. Um,
I like that. I like that very
mhm.
much. Well, let's
Which also
let me
fits
read the
into Tolkien's
passage.
political philosophy, but that's for another day.
Oh, yeah, I guess it would. Huh, that's interesting. I'd like to explore that in the future. Let me read
Yeah.
the passage here. This is from the section of the Eldamar, and this is about the hill of Tuna and the city of Tirion, which I want to just comment on the city of Tirion after I'm done here. But it says here, um, even among the radiant flowers of the tree-lit gardens of Valinor, they longed still at times to see the stars because it's so bright you can't see the stars in Valinor. And they're like, oh, it's beautiful, but I want to see the stars. And therefore, a gap was made in the great walls of the Pelori, and there in a deep valley that ran down to the sea, the Eldar raised a high green hill. Tuna, it was called. Okay, so they put it in a valley, and this is in order that the elves can see the stars. In a valley, they put a hill. Okay, I'm assuming that means that the mountains are so darn high that when you look up, it's like look up from a deep well, you see the night sky instead of the sun. I'm assuming that's what is being suggested here. So,
Hmm. I agree with that. I think
anyways,
exactly because remember the light source is not up above, but over
right, it's
there,
over
and
there. Yeah.
so you get this shadow effect. It's like being on the far side of Mercury. Like you're so close to the sun, you can have total darkness.
That's
On this
cool.
side,
That's
um,
cool. Oh,
and then
by
they
the
can
way,
see the stars. So you can kind of
side note,
daytime, nighttime, daytime. You know.
daytime, yeah. Side note, but you're mentioning of a planet there just sparked my memory. I found out just the other day that on the moon of Titan, there are several
Okay.
mountains that astronomers have named after Tolkien structures.
Oh,
So
really?
all these different mountains on Titan are named after places in Middle Earth, which I think is pretty darn cool. But
That's cool.
look it up,
Um,
it's kind of sweet. Okay, here we go.
all right.
From the west, the light of the trees fell upon it, the hill, and its shadow lay ever eastward. And to the east, it looked towards the Bay of Elvenhome and the lonely isle and the shadowy seas. Then through the Calakiria, the pass of light, the radiance of the blessed realm streamed forth because you got the trees radiating this light through this gap in the mountains, kindling the dark waves to silver and gold, and it touched the lonely isle, and its western shore grew green and fair. There bloomed the first flowers that ever were east of the mountains of Aman. So it's covered in flowers. That's kind of sweet too. And just for the record, this totally rules out the Amazon depiction of Valinor. Okay,
Yeah.
the way that they
Uh,
depict it in the rings of poop, that is completely wrong. Because when she goes off to Valinor, it's like this huge gap in the sky or something, radiant light. No, it's not how it looks. Sorry, but there it is. One more little side note. Now, upon the crown of Tuna, the city of the elves was built. The white walls and terraces of Tirion, and the highest of the towers of that city was the Tower of Ingwe, Mindon Eldalieva, whose silver lamp shone far out into the mists of the sea. Yeah. So Tirion is the name of the city that they build. And yeah. And that's interesting to me because this is the first time that the elves build a city, as far as I know.
yeah.
I mean, maybe I'm wrong on that, but if I go back to the last chapter, it says at the very end of the last chapter, they say, Elu Thingol, or King Grey Mantos, Thingol and Melian. Melian was his queen, wiser than any child of Middle Earth, and their hidden halls were in Menegroth, the Thousand Caves in Doriath. So
Hmm.
Thingol has a fortress in the cave system of Doriath, called Menegroth. But
Hmm.
it's not a structure. I mean, in other words, he hasn't built it using blocks or using stone. It's carved
Right.
out, if anything. Um, and that powerful stronghold lasts all the way up until the inundation period of Menegroth. Um, and I think I was asking the question of what the name of the Elven King in the Hobbit. What is the name of his halls there in the forest of Mirkwood? And most people couldn't answer. I don't think anybody had a real answer. The answer from people that really knew their stuff was that there is no name for it, but it was named in one of the video games as Felagroth
Hmm.
after this city of Menegroth. So there is that. I go with Felagroth, even if it's not what
That's
canon,
possible.
whatever. So it
Right.
seems to work. But my point is, Huron is the first structure that the elves seem to build,
Hmm.
unless I'm greatly mistaken. And it's built on this land of we don't want Galadriel yet. It's built on this land of Tuna. And the
Hmm.
noun, as it says here in the Elvish dictionary, Hirion is the watchtower. In Quenya, it's a mighty tower or the city on a hill.
Hmm.
City of the Elves in the Blessed Realm. And that phrase, city on a hill, was particularly striking to me because that's a phrase that we see in, what is it? The City of
Oh, that
God,
can't be hid.
St. Augustine. Sorry?
The city on a hill cannot be hid.
Right, right.
I mean, that's right
We
in the
see it come
gospel.
up. Dante raises the same image.
Yeah.
The later image is brought up there in America with America's a city on a hill is the phrase that's used. Abraham Lincoln refers to that. So it's a common image, not just that you have a hill, but you have a city on that hill.
Hmm.
So like Palestrina or something. It would have this vast vision, the
That's a
land
city.
around it. A
That's a
city on a
city on a
hill.
hill. Exactly. Most cities in Italy are cities on hills for very practical reasons, both related to weather,
Right,
health, and raiding pirates, land
right.
pirates that go through here about every couple hundred years.
Yes, yes. And certainly for practical reasons that makes sense. But if one visits those cities, like I visited Palestrina and also oh, what's his name? That's easy. Sorry.
Hmm. Yeah.
But when you're there, it is for a practical reason you can see out, but there's also a spiritual sense that goes on with these high cities. Like it feels like you're above it all because you are. And you
Hmm.
have the sound of the birds and air and light. Um,
Hmm.
to be honest, when you're down in the valley areas, it gets pretty stinky. It gets pretty foul. A city that's low to the ground is could be pretty foul and
It can be,
cramped.
yeah, actually.
And
Stale water, stagnant water.
yeah, right, right.
I mean, I think that's the interesting thing is it's not only for defensive purposes. Certainly, there's a practical element to that, but high places tend to be holy places, right? In
Yes,
many, many cultures. In fact, the
yes.
word I mean, then again, to Tuna, Tumna, Tondo, the idea of
Mhm.
the crown of Tara, we get the idea of Tur and Temnos. These are cognates in some early Indo-European languages for sanctuary, holy place, also place on a hill.
Mhm.
Um,
Mhm.
and
Mhm.
so the idea, like, there's a deep connection there. Um, that you've got sanctuary. You have these sanctuaries are up on hills, often before the cities are even made. So
Mhm.
there's an ancient Etruscan city nearby here that people dwelt in caves below it, but up on the hill was simply temple complexes. Nobody inhabited that place. Like that wasn't a defensive maneuver. The sacred sites were there first. Eventually, over time, possibly even the peoples changed. Eventually, over time, the hilltop became inhabited. But first, it was a series of temples. Nobody dwelled up there. Presumably, that's where the gods lived. We
Yeah,
live down here, on the cliff face, at the feet of the hill or on the sides of the hill, but not up on the hill because that's the sacred spot.
yeah,
And eventually that becomes
yeah.
habited. That's to say, so the elves in this case building their city on the hill does not mean it was a defensive move because who would they have to defend against over here? But that they're elevated up because there's something more holy, something more, well, elevated about being at the top of the hill rather than down on the water.
It's an interesting thing that we as humans do, and elves obviously do it in this story, that we as humans do, is that we conceive of up as holy, connected to holy and intellectual and spiritual and all that. And we think of down as being earthy and dark and base, and that's kind of fascinating to me. And only recently has that shifted. And it's not, I don't think it's to the better that it has shifted. Sometime around, I think, I don't know, probably the end of the 19th century, it shifted. And it was no longer up being holy and down being earthy. It was out being towards the planets, not holy necessarily. No.
Interesting.
And I wonder, Joseph Campbell talks about this in one of his works about how that shift actually affects imagination. I don't know. I mean, it must be a negative thing for us to stop thinking about, just like it's to stop thinking about the sun rising and setting, to start thinking about the world rotating like a chicken around a fire, and to no longer think about up, elevated, all that stuff higher up as being holy, but just thinking of it as being out, further into the empty void and the loneliness of space.
And that starts with turning the maps 90 degrees the wrong direction. If east is up on a map, the place where the sun originates and then falls through the course of the day is an up-down motion. As soon as you turn the map to match your longitude, to say, well, north is up, it's nonsensical to say, okay, well, there's something, nothing's coming from the north and falling down the course of the map. Makes sense for stellar navigation, and not just phenomenal, but I mean, using the stars, stellar navigation at sea, in the way that it was calculated at the time, with latitude anyway, and then trying to find longitude to make it all work. But it messes up your whole sort of mythic orientation in the world, your situation in vis-a-vis the cosmos.
Yeah.
To not have it's not that it's bad per se, it might be. It's just there are ramifications that radically shift your world possibilities.
Yeah, absolutely. Yeah. Just the very last thing for my interest in this is that Tuna is a city in the midst of this gap, Calaciria. Beyond this is realms of open field, bright plains. Is the land of heaven. It's what we think of when we think of the Elysian fields in Rome, or the land of heaven itself. It's kind of like this open plains area. So that's what we're doing. This is the best map we have, but yeah, go ahead.
And so then that's where the Valinor live, is further west, the west of west, as it says in Bilbo's last song. And there's a passageway into that west. So the elves are dwelling still in a twilight space, in a liminal space between our ordinary experience and really the divine realm, purely divine realm. And this is where we've got the Vanyar, the elves who become really assimilated into Valar life and culture, and for lack of a better concept. They become so like the gods, they themselves become luminous. They don't ever leave Valinor, right? They stay there in Aman. The Noldor dwell always in this liminal space between the gods and the mundane world, somehow like that.
Right.
So west of these mountains, they dwell right there. And as we'll see, it's the Noldor that learn the crafts from the gods, particularly Aule, and they learn, music, metalsmithing, all this stuff, and crafts, all the things that we know in our own history as men learning from the gods. The elves are learning from the Valar, including occasionally some tutelage by Melkor, which gets Fëanor and Sons into trouble. But we'll get to that point. So the Vanyar over here in Aman with the gods, the Noldor living in the Gap area, and then the Teleri are really living in this island yet. And eventually they move to the shores, and that's kind of situates where the different elves are at the time that the sort of the plot begins in what we enter
So,
into next.
so are is that island that you talked about, is that like here somewhere, or is it on this
I think
map?
it's a little. It's not shown on this map. I think it's a little bit further out in the Bay of Eldamar, based on the
Okay.
description that we read. They're in
So over
sight
here
of
somewhere.
Tyrion, but they're not there. So that's their island, and they become the great
Mm-hmm.
shipfarers, and they build ships. They're the first ones to really build ships
Mm.
that then commerce. So what you end up having, interestingly enough, is a ladder of elves from the Vanyar who are dwelling in the houses of the Valar to the Noldor who are dwelling in Calakiria, and then the Pelori in Elvenhome here, and then the Pelori who stay in the shores of Middle Earth, on the shores of Middle Earth, of which Círdan the shipwright was their chief. And then you've got the elves that dwell in the forest, so Thingol's folk, right, living there. And so you've got this gradation of elves, progressively more luminous and in the light of the gods, to those who are still more in the pre-dawn land of the stars, that connects. It becomes a bridge, rather than seeing these as like a spectrum of like, okay, well, those are worse guys because they're darker and they didn't get in touch with the gods, and then these glowing white guys are really good. Not at all, not at all. He's setting up what Tolkien's doing is setting up a cosmic hierarchy of the ladder, which is a theme that goes way, 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 way back in human history anyway, at least to the Mesopotamian notion of the ziggurat ladder between the gods and men, that you've got a channel, a bridge between the divine and our ordinary life on this Middle Earth, to use the Germanic terminology, right? This
Mm-hmm.
Midyarda. And so you've got the elves then serve as a ladder to ascend to the divine and to descend back to earth, where messages can descend down to earth and then return back up to the divine.
Yeah.
And we'll see various figures traversing this ladder, this bridge between
that.
the gods and man. And then we'll see obviously the Numenorians dwell in the midst of it, right? Numenor becomes situated right in the middle. And we'll see other figures going back and forth throughout the stories. And that's something that cosmic hierarchy to set up.
So even though we don't, I mean, it's wrong to say that elves are equivalent to angels. Obviously, that's not. I mean, he directly said no.
Not at all.
But
No.
they do share with the angelic powers that distinction between one rank and the other, like the nine choirs of angels, is similar to these, if you can call them this, choirs of elves down into the earth.
Yeah, I mean, I think in a certain, in a mirrored way, not because the elves are like the elves are essentially angels. No, if anything, it's the Istaris, it's the wizards that are closer to angels. But following, so the way that this was thought about in ancient Anglo-Saxon culture and ancient Syriac, so this goes way, way back, ancient Near East, because the Anglo-Saxons, strongly influenced by Syriac mythology, there's reasons for it, we're not going to get into it right now, but it's there, is that we'll just take something like Dionysius the Areopagite, ancient Syriac writer. It's true, despite the debates, it's been resolved. There's been, anyway, right? People think Syriac, no, he's Greek. No, he's actually Syriac. And so is it. Well, anyway, he writes there's the celestial hierarchy and the ecclesiastical hierarchy. Because the lower orders mirror the higher orders, and by lower and higher he means like orders of creation, like layers of a cake. And so the whole cosmos is layers of a cake, and the lower layers are not made of the same stuff as the higher layers, but they follow a similar pattern. Just like if you were to lay out a pattern and then drop ink on it, it would bleed through down to the lower layers, and you'd see imprints of that. You have a stack of papers with pictures and you drop some water on it, you'll see the picture on the lower pieces of paper, right? It'll kind of drip through, bleed through. And so in that same way, they follow this same pattern, even though they're not on the same plane of existence. They're not part of this, they're not in the same category or species. And the ancient way of thinking about this then is that there are patterns in our ordinary life, so the realm of human society mirror that same pattern as what we see in the angels. And then at a lower level, you've got material realities, bodily realities first, and then elemental realities, again, mirror the patterns that you see in the higher levels. And that's
Yeah.
seen in various ways, explicitly and more implicitly, throughout a lot of the literature within these respective cultures.
Yep. Yep.
So
Egyptian
again, it's that
called it,
fractalism.
yes. Egyptian culture called it mayat, which is normally translated as
Mhm.
balance. But really what mayat means is as above, so below. And
So
that same
below.
principle then is picked up by Plato in that you have these repeating images that go all the way up this chain of being to the good itself. And that's what he's talking about when he talks about the lesser versus the greater. You know, the connection between A and B is C, which we now call the golden proportion. So it's a similar concept thing up this ladder of imagery, but it's repeating patterns, repeating images. Now, I'm going to open a can of worms here that I don't think we should conclude this, or we should not close this can of worms in this episode because we will not have time. But here's the can of worms. Why is any of that important? Why not just have a big porridge of equality and have no like distinctions at all between anything?
What? More gruel? Just flat?
Cold gruel, sir. You get nothing. Nothing, sir. Yeah.
Well, let's see if
I
our
mean,
intrepid heroes find the answer to that question in the next episode.
yeah. Well, there it is. You know, I think it's a good place to stop too, because we've situated ourselves in a place where now we're getting into the actual narrative. The next
Mhm.
character we're going to see, Feanor, is the catalyst. He's the spark for really the narrative of the rest of the work. And up till now, we've kind of been, after so many episodes on this program, we're finally getting out of the exposition period into the real story. It's kind of striking, but yeah, Feanor is he's the kickoff here. What's going to happen? And if we wanted to talk about why definition is important, rules and patterns and organization, Feanor is a pretty good example of why they are.
Exactly right. Because we see
Yes.
again the patterns played out now in actual, say, human but elvish personal actions. Do those accord with the math of the
Yeah.
metaphysical
Yeah. Farewell, wherever you fare, till the Ares receive you at journey's end.
realm? And may the wind under your wings bear you to where the sun sails and the moon walks.